Now, President Cyril Ramaphosa has launched the private sector-led gender-based violence and femicide response fund to fight the scourge of violence against women and children. In 2019, civil society challenged the private sector to take responsibility and fund the fight to end GBV was formed. Scores of women marched to the Johannesburg Stock Exchange to bring the issue before corporate South Africa and now to caution both the private and public sector against leaving civil society organizations out of discussions about the structure of the fund. We are joined by Mandisa Khanyile, Director at Rise Up Against Gender-Based Violence. Mandisa, very good morning to you. Thank you for joining us bright and early on Newsroom Africa. You've raised your concerns, and this has continued to be a concern throughout the process of managing and curbing gender-based violence. You, together with, of course, civil society groups, the rest of you, have always been concerned about being left out of this very crucial conversation. Talk to us about those concerns.
Yes, we must say, firstly, we are quite impressed that this was launched. So this is a positive thing. This is what we've been calling for, so it's important. However, in different stages of this process, since we initiated this in 2018 with the total shutdown march, and then again in 2019 with the Sandton shutdown at the JSE, we've been finding, for example, private sector knew exactly how to contact us to have conversations about what kind of fund do we want to have, how do we want it administered, what do we see when we talk about a board? A board was established. There was zero consultation. We're now looking at what is the structure of the fund, even though currently the board is an interim structure. We want to know how they want to structure the fund, what accountability mechanisms have they put in place. The money has currently been placed, if I'm not mistaken, with Alexander Forbes and Old Mutual, which is great that we do have a recognized entity that's holding these funds. But how do we hold private sector accountable to themselves? So, I mean, we need to build in those kind of structures. We need to build in those kind of mechanisms. We currently don't have a legislative framework for how we're going to run the GBV Council. The GBV Council is supposed to overlook the entire implementation of the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide. So, I mean, these are the conversations that we want to be having, we want to be brought onto the table. We've been told that there is going to be some kind of civil society engagement. But what we've found, especially with the COVID-19 lockdown, we have these Zoom meetings where there's a determined agenda where you're basically muted if you are a dissenting voice, where you're not really capturing the voice of the woman on the ground, and also it's speaking to privilege and access to data, etc., and systems and apps. So I could go on about this, but I'm saying that we're not saying that this is a bad thing. This is a great move. We're very proud of the presidency for leading this initiative. 8 billion is required for the implementation of the National Strategic Plan over the next 10 years, and we definitely need all the partners on board.
Do you now believe that forming a GBV fund outside of the ambit of government really is the solution that will curb gender-based violence and perhaps find better ways of handling it and ensuring that it doesn't take place?
That was always the plan, that it was going to be an external fund that would manage the response of civil society organizations, government and the private sector in a coordinated way. So that is always what we wanted. We really want accountability and transparency. We obviously don't want to see something similar to what happened with COVID-19 and PPE, what we're currently seeing with SIU. I mean, we have a state that can't necessarily be trusted, especially with money. And we don't want money that's supposed to be going to preventing violence or to add to support mechanisms for women once they have been violated, women and gender non-conforming people, and even men. We don't want those resources to be mismanaged. So we definitely want transparency in the way that the fund is managed. We want it to be managed externally. We want to have access to records. We also want a tracking and tracing process. So if you remember, there was the emergency response plan that was announced soon after we marched to the JSE, where 1.6 billion was issued by the state to fight gender-based violence. What was great about that money is that for the first couple of months, when we still had an interim steering committee for GBVF, there was kind of monitoring on a week-by-week basis. Government departments had to report to say, this week we've launched a sexual offences court. This is what we've done towards getting rape kits, etc., etc. When the interim steering committee on gender-based violence and femicide was disbanded, that went to nothing. And now you have a situation, for example, where the NDA was supposed to disperse funds last year in June to civil society organizations that were managing GBV. Grants were awarded. The money has never, ever landed in the accounts of the NGOs. There's been no mechanisms in place that have been put in order to report what's going on. They've reported to Parliament that they've dispersed the money, but they did not. So how do we prevent those kind of things from taking place if we still allow the very same failed state to run this?
Mandisa, you speak about the importance of capturing the voices of the women on the ground, and your operative word has essentially been accountability. What are the dangers of a lack of accountability in this regard, and how will it impact those who desperately need this fund to be established and work well to make a difference in their lives?
Look, accountability is incredibly important, and we're not just talking about fiscal responsibility here. We're talking about ensuring that everyone who needs to get resources gets allocated. So you know that there's a trickle-down effect, and we want to ensure that if in Anduli there is a clinic that needs rape kits, that clinic needs to be resourced, and there needs to be mechanisms in place to track that those resources get to the right people. What will happen if we don't have proper mechanisms in place is that we're going to see the same response that we've seen to gender-based violence and femicide over the past 10, 15 years, where we announce great legislation, where we announce putting in structures, where we actually develop, for example, the Tutuzela care model, and then we had private sector and philanthropy organizations actually funding it, and the state being completely irresponsible and not doing anything towards that kind of work. And then prior to the 2018 marches, you were actually seeing Tutuzela care centers closing down because they don't have resources. How do you shut down such an imperative and important tool in the fight against sexual violence in particular? So accountability is really important. We need to ensure that whenever resources are allocated for work that is this important, that they get to the right places, that they are used effectively, and that it touches every woman who really needs this on the ground.
We've heard Police Minister Bheki being very vocal and speaking as a point of instruction really to police officers across the country about the role and the importance of taking gender-based violence cases very seriously, making sure that arrests are made and knowing and not allowing whoever is the victim to leave the police station and be told to come back without the police themselves investigating and taking immediate action. When you look at that process and you hear that narrative from the police minister, looking at how its effectiveness, I mean, it could still be too soon to tell, but looking at the processes and the cases that have been put forward already, do you think and do you believe that his voice and the seriousness will make a difference to the manner in which, you know, these cases are dealt with and eventually leading to prosecution?
Look, having political leaders, ministers, the presidency, etc., backing the fight against gender-based violence is really important. That kind of messaging is very important. My bigger concern is I'd like to start seeing more statements from IPID. I'd like to start hearing about what happens internally when a survivor isn't assisted. Because what we had asked for, one of the 24 demands, is that there's a published list of delinquent police stations and delinquent police officers that have been found wanting when it comes to cases. That has never taken place. So there isn't a naming and shaming. So if there's a specific police station that is refusing to assist survivors, currently, as the rest of the country, the mechanism has not been put in place to ensure that we all hold them accountable. So I would rather see that kind of action that actually speaks to, do we see prosecutions properly when police officers themselves are perpetrators of GBV? Are we seeing their colleagues covering for them? Are we still seeing rape inside police stations and inside custody when persons are held at police stations and even in correctional services facilities. So it's great that we have political leadership that speaks the right messaging, but we really want to see proper implementation on the ground. Since the 5,000 plus police officers got sensitization training back in 2019, we haven't really started seeing a full-blown rollout of that. Sensitization training is so important because it allows them to be given skills on how to navigate the system with survivors in a victim-centered approach. Currently, we're having police stations that have police officers and stations that have absolutely no way of interacting properly with survivors. You've got secondary victimization, and there's tools and mechanisms and training that can be given to these police officers. But because we're not seeing budgets being made available, etc., we're not really seeing that kind of work on the ground. So great, we absolutely applaud Minister Peggy and other ministers like Social Development Minister, etc., who've really stepped up. But let's start seeing real work happening on the ground.
Very well. Thank you so much for your time and input. Mandisa Khanyile, Director at Rise Up Against Gender-Based Violence, speaking on behalf of the Call to Action Collective, a grouping of civil society organizations.